Okay, so I have done my case study on a man named Martin Manley. Martin Manley is a guy who killed himself on August 15th of 2013. Killed himself at 5 a.m. on the lawn of a police station where he lived. It wasn't the suicide that piqued my interest. It was more the fact that the guy was 60 years old. It was on his birthday that he killed himself, that he was financially successful, socially successful, had a good career, good reputation, appeared to have everything going for him, and he chronicalized the last year of his life on a website called martinmanley.org. He chronicalized his attempts to leave a legacy and to explain why he committed suicide. And I'll get to his explanation for why he did it later, but in the website he discloses why a person would commit suicide and how he's this anomaly, how he is not like everybody else because he claimed to have no medical illness, which he believed is a common reason for suicidality. And he also claimed to have no sort of substance use at all in his life, certainly within the last year of his life. He claimed to have no legal issues. He claimed to have never experienced, or not recent, or in fact not in the length of his lifetime, any trauma that was overwhelming that he had not yet recovered from. He reported to have no financial concerns. And he reported to have healthy social support systems in church and friends and poker teams and all these things he reported to have. Except as I read through his chronicalized journey leading up to his suicide, I found some discrepancies. And part of this assignment was to give charge to see if the man or the individual had any criteria to fit a diagnosis. Martin Manley denied any sort of diagnosis, any sort of depression, any sort of reason to commit suicide. However, according to the reasons he stated why people would commit suicide, he had none of those symptoms. One being he had no medical illness by his own disclosure. Later, though, as I read through the year 14-month journal that he presented, I found that he admitted to having a failing memory so bad that he couldn't remember watching a movie, and worse than that still, he couldn't remember writing a review of that same movie because he would sit down to write a movie to post it on his website, sportsandreview.com, and he would see it was already there. He failed to remember. He'd watched the movie and even written a review. He couldn't remember his own address. He would sit down to purchase something, and he couldn't remember the name of the address. He lived at almost 10 years. He'd have to go find an envelope somewhere that had his address on it because he couldn't remember his own address. He couldn't remember the song that he had at church. He'd been rehearsing for 3 weeks. It just left his mind. And the statement he made is, "I just didn't want it to get worse." Sounds to me like he was in the early stages of Alzheimer's. He reported to only eat one meal a day, because that's all he wanted to eat. That was all that he was concerned with. That's all he wanted to make time for. That's all that mattered for him. He also reported to have an extreme obsession with numbers. He would get started doing things and just not want to stop. But it was just in his work. It was as a sports analyst. He analyzed statistics, and that's what he did. And so he was constantly wrapped around that. He also described his sleeping habits were like a basketball player who scores 2 in one game, then 20 in another, 7 in one game, then 21 in another. It was incredibly inconsistent. He couldn't go to sleep until 3 a.m. And he said his own statement was, "I felt sleep deprived most of my life, even though I had 6 hours of sleep." And he would stay up for 36 hours and sleep for 12. That was his best approach to life. And so he also denied the effects of a sleep pattern on a daily routine. And so all of those things put together seems to me like there was some medical problem going on. There was memory issues. There was a circadian rhythm that just couldn't get established, which likely caused cognitive or emotional impairments. The eating possibly could have even been malnutrition. Seems to me from some of the things he had wrote, he was maybe living on 800 to 1,000 calories a day. Not much sustainment for a guy his size. He reported no substance use in his initial statement to why suicide, and that was consistent, which also really piqued my interest. He had, in the whole year, 14 months, he went through his whole life. No time in his life had he ever use any substances, any alcohol. He drank soda. He drank water. In the last years of his life, he drank water. That was it. He had no legal issues. That was consistent with his year-long journal entries. Now, interestingly, he said he had experienced no recent traumatic deaths. But later, and I read through, he reported being significantly traumatized by Hurricane Sandy and Newtown, Connecticut, and the Boston Marathon, and Moore, Oklahoma. And his statement was, "I was seriously broke my heart." He was living in a life of grief, overwhelming grief. Now, he wasn't present in any of those events. It was all of his trauma was secondary, so it would have been secondary. It seemed almost like secondary post-traumatic stress, where symptomologically there was probably depression there linked to that trauma he was experiencing. The other element that he mentioned half a dozen times, I think, in his writings is a financial despair of the United States. He was overwhelmingly concerned that collapse is inevitable, was the very statement. He was concerned that the end of the United States is near, and he didn't want to be a part of that. He had reported to have no financial concerns yet. As I read through, he disclosed that his life insurance runs out at the age of 60, and he couldn't afford to get more. Sounds to me like a financial concern. He said he had healthy supports or healthy social systems and all sorts of support systems, except he had 2 ex-wives, no children, and his ex-girlfriends he had in high school he reported to be more important to him than his own wives. In fact, those ex-girlfriends were special until his dying breath. I don't think he ever recovered that loss. He was unable to see inanimate objects that remind him of his ex-wives. He couldn't go by a patch of clovers without having an emotional breakdown because of it. He reported, back to the medical illness and possibly Alzheimer's, he reported fear of getting lost for several weeks, and nobody would even know the difference. So that links the Alzheimer's with the truly healthy social support system. Getting lost for several weeks, nobody even knows. Yeah, somebody that's healthy social support systems would be missed if they were lost for 2 weeks. Both of his parents were dead. His brother and sister lived distant emotionally and geographically. He had no nieces, no nephews, or any of his own children. And he felt like he wasn't needed by anyone. And had he been needed by someone, by his own words, he would not have committed suicide. So even though he denied the elements of depression and suicide, what can lead to that, he denied the existence of those things. As I read through his year-long journal leading up to his suicide, they were there. He had plenty of reason to be depressed and lonely and be in grief, and nobody knew about it. Nobody at all knew about it. So concerning diagnostic criteria, I had to get to that. My initial assumption was major depressive disorder. Hopelessness of career, life after 60 in the common United States. He said my life made zero difference to anyone, so he had a report of hopelessness, diminished interest of pleasure in almost all of his life, because at another time he said I'm not able to stop and smell the roses like other people. Possibly a bit of anhedonia in there. Consistent insomnia, can't sleep well. Fatigue or loss of energy nearly every day, because he said that he would wake up and actually never really feel awake for 2 to 3 hours. It would take him to fully feel awake. He'd feel worthless. Suicide wouldn't have occurred if anybody really needed him or cared about him. He believed suicide would be and his suicidality was consistent from the age of 12. That he believed that he would die by suicide even at the age of 12. And that's consistent with the development and course of this disorder to occur around the age of puberty. So major depressive disorder possibly fits. He denies anyone in his life, any time in his life when he was truly happy, except for when he was planning his own death, because he wanted to control his own destiny. He had no control or joy in his life. He had consistent premeditation with his suicide, and he was fully aware. Prior to his suicide, he did this 14-month chronicalized website, martinmanley.org. He sent emails. He managed all of his finances. He sold all of his personal belongings. He bought the gun. He did everything he needed to do. This website was purchased for 5 years because he wanted to ensure he would not be forgotten, and a way to tell everyone that they were not responsible for his decision because he was in control of his own destiny, which is simply a statement to me that says he really felt like life was out of his control. It seemed like he had something to prove to the world. I think major depressive disorder had been something he suffered from his entire life. I didn't see ADHD or bipolar because there was no manic behavior. There wasn't inability to remain focused. There wasn't any hyperactivity. However, with major depressive disorder occurring for 2 years, the poor appetite, the no physiological effect of substance, and that the client had never been without the symptoms, the Martin Manley should actually have received a comorbid diagnosis of persistent depressive disorder with melancholic features due to loss of pressure, empty mood, despair, early onset at the age of 12, with persistent major depressive disorder, severe. Successful suicide. I would say it was severe. Concerning his intervention, I think it could have come from his social supports. Martin Manley had been involved in the church. He was singing for the church. Pretty unfortunate. At a young age, he had memorized more than what most people ever memorize of the Bible. He had memorized the entire book of James. He had memorized several other ones. He had memorized the first 5 chapters of Peter, first 5 chapters of Matthew. He had memorized Colossians. He had memorized First Peter, the first 3 chapters of First Timothy, and he stopped memorizing because he realized that there just wasn't enough time in the day, because he would recite them in order to maintain the memory and then memorize another verse, and then recite it all and say a new verse, and he would just run out of time. It wasn't practical to him. So I wonder, I guess part of me feels grieved because the church didn't recognize it. However, according to the major depressive disorder diagnosis, it says that many of those who interact with the affected individual are unaware of depressive symptoms. So they didn't even know. I mean, they had no idea, because nobody was really involved in his life. Nobody was placing value on him outside of the tune he carried. Other intervention could have come in the form of pharmacology with SSRIs. As an antidepressant, and I think depression-focused CBT probably could have been effective in group therapy to let him know he's not alone. It's not always like this. But Martin Manley refused to accept his depression, and he believed his suicidality was due to the age of 60, and he had a completed life and nothing more to offer, because up to that point life hadn't offered him much in his own mind. I think the best intervention for him would have been a close group of friends to live in a genuine community where he would have been comfortable to report his worldview concerning his age, his social demise, and confess his failing memory. It could have been this community that would have prompted Manley to do what was necessary to receive the help that he needed. It's unfortunate, because it seemed like the church lived with him, and we dropped the ball. So Martin Manley, he chronicalized his suicide for 14 months leading up to it, denying any depression, denying any problems. And here's what he said. Here is why he said that he wanted to kill himself. In his own words, "Knowing when is your last day on earth is amazingly liberating. It places a sense of urgency upon all that you do. It removes the fog of a complicated life and worries about the future. It makes you prioritize as you probably should have all along." I think Martin Manley severely suffered from major depressive disorder, and I think he had a comorbid diagnosis of persistent depressive disorder that, had he been treated, he'd still be here today, realizing that he too can stop and smell the flowers.